Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt. Professor Paul Gilbert really needs no introduction. He is the founder of compassion-focused therapy. He's also founder of the Compassionate Mind Foundation. He's written numerous books, not least the seminal book, The Compassionate Mind, as well as other key books, Human Nature and Suffering, Overcoming Depression, a self-help guide, Mindful Compassion, written with Choden, Compassion-Focused Therapy, Distinctive Features, Living Like Crazy, and of course co-editor with Professor Gregoris Simos, Compassion-Focused Therapy, Clinical Practice and Applications. There are so many more books, as well as many hundreds of research publications. The cornerstone of compassion-focused therapy is Paul's integrated model of the mind. He incorporates the psychological and psychophysiological sciences and neuroscience and the wisdom traditions as well. But really at the heart of it is an evolutionary approach and an understanding of the evolved emotional processing systems of the brain, not least threat, drive, and soothing-affiliative systems. Paul has recently published a paper titled Threat, Safety, Safeness, and Social Safeness 30 Years On, Fundamental Dimensions and Distinctions for Mental Health and Well-Being. In there, he explores the CFT concepts that while the threat system is the default mode and motivated towards threat protection and safety seeking, the soothing affiliative system can help to down-regulate threat and cultivate a feeling of safeness, especially social safeness, which in turn has positive effects on physical and psychological well-being. Here, the distinction between safety and safeness matters. It was a wonderful experience to have such a stimulating conversation with Paul Gilbert. There are many takeaways in this video, and so I bring you Professor Paul Gilbert. Professor Paul Gilbert, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Well, thank you, Stan. It's a delight to be with you because I've known you a long time, and you're doing great stuff with these programs and videos. It's just fantastic. I learn a lot actually from listening to your interviews.
Oh, goodness. Wow. That's very good feedback. Thank you. We had a conversation in August 2021, I think. But, well, boy, the world's kind of changed since then. And CFT, I guess, has changed a lot since then as well.
Very much so. Yes, I mean, and in the science of compassion, the science is moving on, and we move on with the science. So you're quite right about that.
One of your recent papers is titled Threat, Safety, Safeness and Social Safeness 30 Years On, Fundamental Dimensions and Distinctions for Mental Health and Well-Being. I'd like to unpack that in a moment, but I wanted to start. You have a number of really great quotes and aphorisms that I use all the time when I'm talking about compassion and with clients as well, and so on. The mind is like a spotlight, not that which it shines upon. Compassion is the courage to descend into the reality of the human experience. It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And may I be helpful rather than harmful towards myself and others. These are all such powerful, brief statements that capture, I think, key aspects of CFT. And so before we try to properly unpack it all, I just wondered, how would you capture the distinction between safety and safeness? Perhaps in a pithy, memorable kind of statement like that?
Well, I suppose safety is protection and safeness is expansion. It's freedom. Okay, so when you're
Ah,
focusing on
hmm.
safety, it's about stopping things happening, bad things happening to you, checking everything, they're putting your seatbelt on and all that. And it's important. But safeness then allows you to now explore your environment without worrying about if you're going to be hit by something. So when we're in safety mode, we keep vigilant. So it's like when if you go to a party and you don't know anybody and you're kind of, but then you see your best friends and all of a sudden, oh, wow, hi. Everything
Mm.
changes.
Hmm.
You're going to have a good time because you feel safe with these people. You're not amongst strangers. So these are ways in which we can begin to think about it. And of course, we're very, very rooted in attachment theory. So all of this stuff really is not actually my stuff. It comes from attachment theory that make a distinction between the concept of a secure base versus a safe haven. So a secure
Mm.
base
Hmm.
in attachment theory is what allows the child to go and explore and develop and learn about themselves, and the parent is always there as a backup and doing all of that. So the child goes out and learns about the world. Whereas a safe haven is what happens when the child is distressed and is then calmed down and settled and so on and so on. So these are really very important distinctions. Um,
Yes, yes, I really appreciate that. Safety is about protection, and safeness is about expansion and freedom.
yeah, freedom.
Hmm. Even that really captures something very, very helpful. I was hoping we might step through the process behind threat detection and response, safety and safety seeking, and then safeness, how safety and safeness are different. And what is social safeness? But let's start with threat detection and response. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, as you know, in CFT, we take an evolutionary approach. There are the three basic challenges of life. The first challenge of all living things is to protect them, to identify and protect themselves to threats to their existence. So even the bacteria in your gut can detect toxic areas and will move away. So animals that can move, they will engage their movement system in order to protect themselves from threats. Now, sometimes, of course, they freeze or faint or whatever. But then you also got to go out and achieve things, gain resources, find food. And if you're a sexually reproducing organism, you have to find a mate. So you have to get out into the world. You can't just be responding to threats. You have to get out in the world. We call that the seeking or the reward. And then, of course, the third thing is you have to be able to rest and digest. All living things need to be able to do that from some period of time. You can't just be complete sympathetic over arousal or running away or seeking food or whatever. So rest and digest is very important. So those are your three basic life tasks. And those three life tasks are supported by the three emotion systems that you talk a lot about in your programs. Um, so your threat system has two types of threat. It's threat to actually like a predator or something happening to you or getting beaten up or whatever. But another form of threat is the threat of the inability to achieve food. You can't find the food, you can't get the things you need, right? So your seeking system is thwarted. You're not that's a quite an important source of threat. So the threat doesn't come from some external process attacking you or getting sick or something like that. The threat comes because you're not able to do certain things to survive or prosper or flourish. So the threat system has those two elements to it. And when we come to self-criticism threat, it's often focused on the latter. You're not able to do this. You're going to fail. You're not going to be any good. You're going to be rejected. So it's the threat around the inability to pursue what you see as important for your flourishing, for your security, for your safeness, and so on, as opposed to the threats coming from the outside that somebody's going to come and hurt you or you're going to get a disease or something.
Okay, even that's food for thought for me. There are these two basic types of threat. There's some threats that are kind of towards us, a predator, say, that might be a source of threat. But the other source of threat is our needs are blocked or unmet, the food we need or the resources we need. might somehow be thwarted. And both those can be sort of activating of the threat system. I think you talk in the paper about external and internal
Yeah.
threats. Can you elaborate there?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Dan. So paranoia, for example, the threat is usually outside, people are going to hurt you or whatever. So the threat is externally directed. Social anxiety, it's more internal. You're going to do stuff that people will reject you. They are very nice people, but it's just that you're not any good, blah, 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 blah. So the external threat is really very much about how you perceive the outside world as a threatening place that can hurt you and harm you. And that's important because when individuals are focused in on that, we had a question about this the other day in clinical supervision. Things like soothing rhythm breathing don't always help people when they're into that safety system, when they're trying to deal with external threats. So when you're dealing with people who are on the more paranoid side or have slightly psychotic experiences, um, the soothing rhythm breathing can actually make them worse because it makes them much more sensitive. They feel they're going to lose their sensitivity to the outside world. But it's an internal threat, then it's a different kind of process. The threat is because of maybe the way I see myself. I don't feel I'm adequate. And sometimes it's to do with threats that have happened to you. So they're traumas that have sensitized you. The question is how the trauma has sensitized you, whether the trauma has sensitized you to become distrusting about the world. I can't trust other people because they're out to hurt me. And then that takes you more into the safety dimensions, or whether it's actually undermine your sense of confidence because you've been told you're useless or you're whatever it is. So it's that you can't trust yourself to be assertive or to defend yourself or whatever. So those are important. But I think, as you've discussed in some of your programs, all of these things are not categorical. They're not black and white. They're all sort of blend into each other. They overlap. You can have a bit of this and a bit of that. Those are ways in which we can distinguish the internal from the external.
The external can be actual or perceived,
Yeah, absolutely.
and the internal can be self attacking or perhaps even conditioned from earlier life experiences of actual threat. So they can sort of feed off each other a little bit, and the external and the internal.
Yeah, Bob Leahy. I don't know if you interviewed Bob Leahy. He's got some great stuff on the way we become threatened by our own emotions, by our own fantasies, our own memories, our own internal world. We can, I shouldn't be feeling this, or, he talks about, I've had an argument with my wife. Oh, that shouldn't have happened. That means I'm a bad person because I got angry with somebody I love. All that sort of stuff. The ways in which the experience of the internal world, our memories, our fantasies, our desires can play out in our mind, that we can actually be ashamed of what we're experiencing. So that again, he talks a lot about this internal process. So he has emotional schema therapy, he calls it. But I think that's really quite important as well, that people can become ashamed of what they think, of what they feel, or what they're unable to do. And that issue of shame is obviously a big threat.
One of the things you've certainly taught me is to not forget some of the core psychological theories, the behavioral theories, for example, the conditioning
Yeah. Right.
processes. One of my favorite jokes is, why does Pavlov have such lovely hair? Because he uses classical conditioning. Well, yeah. It's not a great joke, but yeah, the theory seems to be that in terms of some of the internal threats, that perhaps they might arise out of some sort of classical conditioning processes that perhaps from one's life or one's experiences.
Yes, very much so. And I think that's a very, very important point. I mean, we are very into classical conditioning because we're often also very into creating different kind of physiological states in order for you to process threats. So if you can get your vagus nerve going, if you can get that grounding in the sense of a secure base or whatever, and then process threat, that makes your threat processing much easier to do. There's quite a lot of on the research now that when people feel safe or connected, their ability to cope with threats is different than when they feel alone and isolated. So all those things are very, very important in terms of creating the physiological context for learning to occur, which in a way is what Pavlov was about, right?
Mm.
And we often
Hmm.
say that, it's how we talk to our clients. Like, if you trauma is very much a sort of classically conditioned experience. I mean, if you like cheesecakes, I don't know if you, I can't remember if you do actually, Stan, like cheesecakes. Um,
I like them a lot.
you like them or not. But then, so I don't want to upset you, but supposing one day you eat a cheesecake and it makes you really ill, you're violently sick, both ends going, that sort of thing. The chances are when you recover from that and somebody says, "Oh, Stan, I bought you a cheesecake and I know how much you like them," and you smell it, you're going to have an immediate nauseous reaction. You don't have a cognition. Oh, it's a cheesecake. Hang on a moment. The last time I had a cheesecake, I was sick. Oh, yeah, now I feel nausea. No, it's not like that, right? It's an immediate physiological response to the cue, and that's how trauma can also work. That there's an immediate physiological response to the cue. So moving on a little bit, if you have you love going on holidays and then one day you get badly beaten up and you're sent home in an ambulance, the next time there's a cue to holidays, going on holidays, your body will go, right? Now, if you've got trauma in your care system for abuse or neglect or whatever it is, then get the cue, like somebody suddenly gets angry with you or you get into a conflict or whatever, the body's gone, right? Now, Bessel van der Kolk talks a lot about this. The body keeps the score. All of that stuff is really about the way the body learns to respond to cues, and that's basically classical conditioning. That's what classical conditioning is. How the body responds, how a dog responds to a bell that starts salivating. And
Mm.
the
Mm.
joke there, why didn't Pavlov use cats? Because when he sounded the bell, the cat said, "I'm so sorry, I've had lunch elsewhere today."
Great.
Anyway, silly joke. But yeah, the classical condition is very, very important in CFT. How the body responds to cues is very, very important. And again, there's been lots and lots of studies done on that in behavioral science. So
I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but perhaps like I'm assuming that maybe that's what's behind some of our fears of compassion as well. Various classical conditioning experiences that lead to the caring system being compromised, and so caring feels sort of threat system activating.
yeah, that's absolutely right, Stan. And I know you've talked about this. All of the motives can carry FBRs, fears, blocks, and resistances. You can have them in your sexual system, or you can have them in your competitive system. Some people are frightened to be assertive, and so on and so on. But you can certainly have them in your care system, where you become frightened to be compassionate to yourself or to others, and or to trust others. Compassion. My mate James Kirby's
Uh
done
huh.
a
Yeah.
fantastic meta-analysis in 2019 on the fears of compassion. And the data is that actually the fear of receiving compassion, the data is getting stronger on this now, of receiving compassion, being open, not being shame-prone and closed down, that's a bigger predictor of depression than self-compassion, actually.
Mm.
And again, it all brings us all always back to this issue that we're a social species where interconnectedness is crucial. And the moment we get cut off or we feel ashamed and rejectable or whatever. And of course, when you do your therapeutic work, as you well know, the depth of people's loneliness when you get into it underneath with the depressions and all of that, they're desperately lonely. And that grieving process, that yearning to feel loved and wanted to connected, that always sits just
Ah,
just there.
yes.
But
Yes.
they're very frightened of it, you see, very frightened to go there.
It's one of the real tragedies, isn't it? I think that this sort of this double bind. That they would like more than anything to have people to feel close to, connected with, safe with, and at the very same time, it's just so scary. And activates the threat system and this kind of safety seeking system.
Very much so, very much so. And I mean, there's a very fascinating book that I read when I was a young therapist, and it was called "I Hate You, Don't Leave Me," and it's really about that dilemma about, if you get close to me, then I'm frightened you're going to hurt me, but if you pull away, then I'm frightened you're going to leave me and leave me alone. That dynamic is a very powerful dynamic, particularly for people who come from abusive backgrounds, and they're really caught. Whichever way they move, the threat system goes bang. If they move away and try and separate, then they feel this terrible sense of disconnection and loneliness. But if they try and get close to people, then they feel this almost paranoid sense that now you can find out about me, now you can hurt me. And you've seen the video that we showed from Good Will Hunting. Do you remember that
Mm,
when he
yeah.
says, yeah, she asks him to go with her to another city, and he says, yeah, well, but if I go with you, you might find out something about me that you didn't know before, and now you'll be with me in a new city, and you found out this bad thing and you won't want me anymore, but you won't be able to say you won't want me because you have taken me to this new city. So now I'm stuck with somebody who doesn't really want to be with me. And so that issue, which I thought was played out brilliantly in Good Will Hunting, we use it in our shame training, is a massively important dynamic. I'll let you get close, only to the extent that you won't find out I'm not going to show you my dark side because then you will reject.
And in that scene, out came Will's anger, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The sort of the rage, I guess, and yes, he became enraged, and Skylar, I think it was Skylar,
This
yeah,
guy.
was kind of well shocked and distraught that Will might react in that sort of way. I first watched that movie on a plane, and there was sort of tears, rolling down my cheeks. And the flight attendant came and said, "Oh, are you okay?" And I'm like, "I'm just watching Good Will Hunting." So it was a bit strange.
Yeah. But I mean, I mean, see, when you get good script writers, I think Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, they actually wrote the script, or whatever. Or I think his mother's a therapist or something. But it was fantastic. It was a brilliant script, absolutely brilliant. And we always would say, if script writers can write this kind of stuff and understand these processes, then sure, that's how psychologists should.
Yes. So if we could just unpack safety checking, monitoring, seeking behaviours. What are some of the range of things there that we might be thinking about?
So your monitoring behavior is, as you said, firstly for the external threats. Is there a threat? Can I get into harms? That sort of thing. But the other one is the monitoring. Am I going to be able to achieve what I want to be able to achieve? And if I can't, what is the threat for that? Now, as you know, we've done a lot of work and developed a measure called striving to avoid inferiority. And what we've found is that people are very competitive, and those individuals who we call secure strivers, these are individuals who say, well, if I fail, I'll fail, I'll be disappointed, but that's the way it is. But it's okay because people around me will support me. And, if I have a gamble, I lose money, then I can turn to my friends and they give me some money, whatever. Those individuals are pretty good. They're quite happy competing because they're not worried about failing. But those who are seeking to avoid inferiority, they have the beliefs that if they fail, then people will start to reject them, and they won't be helped. There won't be people around to pick up the pieces if they collapse or they make mistakes. They'll be criticized for it rather than helped. So they have a fear of the three big fears of missing out. I won't be able to. The passive rejection, people will say, "Oh, hi, Stan. Yeah, great. Are you okay if I don't come see you today? Is that all right? And yeah, we'd had a party last week. I just didn't think about it. I'm so sorry. That passive, you just sort of,
Mm-hmm.
you don't
Yep.
to people kind of thing, but they're present. They're not rejecting you. And then there's the act of rejection. I'm sorry, we've decided we don't want you, because you're not this and you're not that. So those are the things. I'm going to miss out on opportunities to flourish. I'm going to be passively. People will be nice to me, but I won't really be included in anything. And then the other one is I will be actively rejected. And so people monitor for that, and social anxiety, depression, all of these People are monitoring to the degree to which they have what it takes to be loved and wanted and cared for. When they feel that they're not up to it for whatever reason, because of the wrong size, the wrong shape, they don't have the abilities or whatever it is, then they start to struggle.
We're monitoring for those threats, and then we're sort of seeking safety, I guess, through
Yeah.
certain actions or things we might do. You seem to allude to self-criticism as a safety-seeking behaviour. Is that how you would see self-criticism?
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff, self-criticism only trying to help you. We always, as you know, say, no, don't go down that road because people get confused because it's a threat, it is a safety system. If you don't, then this will happen to you. So it has two elements to it. Self-criticism, it tends to warn you. If you don't pull your socks up, if you don't do this, if you don't try harder, blah, 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 look what other people are doing compared to you. Uh, this is going to happen to you. That's one of the aspects. And the other thing it tends to do is to label you, which is you're useless, you're weak, you're pathetic, you're no good. And you've done this many times in your own clinic and stuff when we do the function analysis. What does your critic look like? What does it say? And critics tend to be pretty vicious, right? They're not out to help you. That will not help you. And of course, when people get into it, they realize that actually, when I listen to my critic, I don't feel inspired and encouraged, and yes, I'm going to do better. They actually feel kind of beaten down and defeated.
Yeah.
And again,
Uh-huh.
just down the
Yep.
road from you, James and his colleagues have shown that when you get into self-criticism, you're whacking into the amygdala big time. This is a threat. Okay, it's threatening you. It is not helping you. And the reason it's threatening you is because it's responding from this fear. If you don't, you will be rejected. Okay, you will not be worth nothing. Nobody will want you. You will be an insignificant piece of crap, basically. And that's often what the critic comes up with, right? That's the fear. And when you do your compassion work, you never go for the anger, you always go for the fear underneath, that fear of loneliness. And I think, Grigoris Simnos that you interviewed said, it's a civil war. I listened to,
Mm.
I think you had a lovely interview with Grigoris. He called it a civil war. Well, if it's a civil war, you don't want to get in and start chucking bombs around. You need out of the system, you need into the compassion system. You have compassion for the fears that driving that. You have compassion for the memories that self-criticism might be based on, like, being bullied or whatever. So you always go for the underlying elements of this loneliness, this rejection that the criticism is kind of sitting on top of.
Mm.
Um, that's why we see, as you say, it's a safety behavior, it's a threat, it's a warning and a labeling. And you've got to get underneath that and not take it on,
Mm.
because I
Mm.
was listening to somebody else who does self-criticism work, and they say, you've got to stand up against it. No, no, don't do that, because you just add to the civil war. And what you find
Mm.
is that if people they might be okay with that for a bit, but if they get depressed, they lose. The critic will always win. If you start trying to argue with it, the critic will always win. It will always be more powerful than you because it will beat you down into submission, into depression eventually. So you have to get out of it and realize that actually I'm criticizing myself because actually I just feel very frightened. I
Yeah.
just feel very
Yeah.
lonely, and I don't want to be. I don't want to be here. I don't want to be vulnerable to this.
Yes, and as you said at the start, often people do feel like the critic is somehow on their side. And I notice that when working with self criticism, sometimes you have to do that little trick of yours. Anything else? Anything else? Because it seems like people often will start to consider their self criticism, but at a kind of a light end of the spectrum in a way.
Yeah.
The bit that maybe sounds a little mean, but a little bit okay almost. And but if you explore further, kind of beneath all that, when we arrive at what people are actually saying to themselves, that's it can really be striking. actually, can't it? Where the critic can take us.
Yeah, because it's also linked into a raging. I mean, the other thing is obviously, I mean, Freud's idea of anger turned inwards, I think, is also really quite an important process for some clients. But we talked about it as defensive exclusion. And we use the example of the Aztecs. You know, the Aztecs do all these sacrificing to please the gods, and when the rains don't come, they're not angry with the gods. They say, what do we do wrong? We didn't do enough. Okay, we'll do more, we'll do more. So when you get into that power dynamic, right, where you're being attacked, the submissive part of you will say, oh, okay, I'll do everything I can. Don't attack me. I'll try again. I'll try harder. And people tend to think of that system as potentially helpful, but it isn't. It's an attacking system. And you need to get out of it, especially, you know, by working with the fears and the fears of loneliness and so forth. So it's really taking us, you know, back in the circle a little bit, but helping people see that although they think the critic is helping them, it actually isn't. And part of the reason is because it's to do with the hostility. Now, Leslie Greenberg and Bill Welton showed this. It's, you know, if I say to you, oh, Stan, look, you know, these interviews you do, have you thought about doing this? You might be able to do that. You know, that would be good. And you perceive that as, oh, yeah, that's a good idea, Paul. I think I'll have a go at that. You will. If I, on the other hand, say, that stuff you're doing, you know, I mean, what the hell are you doing? Why are you doing that? You should be doing this. You're not doing. If I do an attack version of it, you'll have a totally different experience,
Mm.
the thing I'm trying to help you with. So what we know in self-criticism is because it's a threat, it comes through the attack system. Because it comes through the attack system, it's experienced with hostility. You don't experience your critic as saying, you've done great there. But I tell you what, I'm going to give you one or two little tips where you can get even better, right? If you went to a coach or you're learning the piano or guitar, or because you're a great guitarist or whatever, and you have your coach is saying, okay, look, that's okay, but you got your hand slightly wrong. I can show you. Look, if you practice these things, you're gonna get really good. You'd accept it. But if your coach says to you, look, how many times have I shown you the bloody exercises? If you don't do them, you're not going to get any better. Just bloody well do them. Your whole experience of that advice of improvement would be totally different. So one of the problems with the critic is it's the hostility of the critic. That's the problem. And that's why we distinguish it from what we call compassionate self-correction. Actually, criticism itself is not really the problem, because we have, you know, it's good to actually see where we've done things and can change things. The problem is the hostility. And the reason you have the hostility is because it's coming from the threat system. It's either an internalized threat from someone else, or it's to do with your fear. You're frightened that if you don't shape up something, you know, you're going to be rejected or whatever.
Oh, it was eye-opening, really, when I first discovered your thoughts about the different forms and functions of self-criticism. That's kind of key here, isn't it? There are certain forms,
Yeah.
and compassionate self-correction and encouragement. It's a form, in a way, you know, of being able to reflect and kind of critique, you know, what we're doing and improve. It's an
Yeah.
improvement oriented thing, I think, and there are other forms that are much more shame based self criticism, and
Very much.
that's that hostility, as you say. I mean, one of the funny things about safety seeking behaviours, people often report that they do feel a kind of relief somehow, but you really distinguish that from feeling safe. How would you you know, sum that up a bit?
Yeah, so I think that's very, and again, you know, there's nothing original to us. I mean, you know, a lot of the CBT people, because we use a lot of CBT, as you know, um, talk a lot about safety-seeking behaviors and how safety-seeking behaviors can actually make things worse for you. You know, a classic example is, you know, somebody has a panic, uh, sits down, and they think because they've sat down, they've slowed down, that's why they didn't have the heart attack. So they attribute the benefits of to the safety behavior, but actually the safety behavior is making the problem worse and it's not actually helping them. So that's That's standard in CBT. The safety behaviors can actually make things worse. But safety behaviors are also very helpful to you. If you're going to go rock climbing or you get in your car, checking that your brakes are working and your seatbelt's working or your ropes are working, that's very, very important. So, safety behavior is extremely important to do, but there are types of safety seeking which are helpful, and there are types of safety seeking that are not. And again, it's making that distinction. It's not that one's good and one's bad. It's all to do with context and how you're using your safety behaviors, either to facilitate you to go rock climbing, or are you using your safety behaviors to avoid things that actually you need to learn how to cope with? So one of the key issues in behavioral, Paul Psychopoulos and others have talked a lot about this, is helping clients make that distinction between when safety behaviors is sensible, like, don't go to certain parts of the town, in the middle of the night. That might not be such a good thing to do, as opposed to safety behaviors and avoidance, which actually is harmful to you. Not being assertive, or not being able to having to wash all the time because you've got OCD or whatever it is. So it's a quite great point you make this, because safety behaviors are tricky things, and distinguishing between when they're helpful and when they're not is very important. Safeness, on the other hand, is when, in a sense, that's been sorted. Okay, you've sorted that, so you're not vigilant to threat, and now you're like the child that's going to go and explore and have fun, and you feel able to go and do your seeking behaviors, and you can get on and enjoy life, and there are people around you that are stimulating your vagus nerve, and you feel connected. And then, of course, if you start to lose that connection, that loneliness, then that reactivates threat system, and now you're back into the whole business of safety.
It's interesting, just like self-criticism, there are forms and functions of safety-seeking behaviours in a
Yeah,
way,
that's right.
and that's where I expect that some of the wisdom comes into it, the wisdom of compassion, being able to, I guess, tell the difference really between those behaviours that are helpful versus those more safety-seeking behaviours that are unhelpful or even harmful.
That's exactly right. And so the compassion gives you the courage to drop your safety behaviors that are unhelpful. But it also gives you the wisdom to pay attention to safety behaviors that are helpful, right? So when we had COVID, there was say we talked about safe relating and so on and so on. Um, not getting drunk and driving, that's not a good thing to be doing. So, the idea that safety behaviors are very, very important, provided they're contextual. But when you've addressed safety, that's done. What do you do now? It's that next bit. What you do. An example, because it was a client that alerted me to this many, many years ago, socially anxious client. We were doing imagery, safe place imagery. And in those days, we did quite simply, we're just trying to help people sort of have a sense of safeness and blah, blah, blah. And he said, "Oh, yeah, I've always had a safe place." I said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "Yeah, I always imagine myself in this bunker, and this bunker is underground. Nobody knows where it is. And it's got 4-inch steel walls, and I've got machine guns on the tops. And if anybody comes close, I can just blast them." He said, "I just feel great in this because I know nobody." And I said to him, "Oh, that's interesting. But how do you get out? Because you're going to be stuck there, aren't you?" And he hadn't really thought about that. He just thought that if he could stop, find a place in the world where he could feel safe, because no one could get to him, no one could hurt him, no one could. Of course, his anxiety turned out to be the slight paranoid form, but it was a really interesting thing. And he thought that that was about being safe. And once he was safe, he'd watch his television or whatever it was, but he'd never be free. He'd never be able to get out of that place. He would be trapped in it. So safety behaviors can trap you as well, and helping clients realize when your safety behaviors are trapping you in a lifestyle that perhaps is not the one you want. And
And this is exactly why I wanted to speak with you about this distinction, because I agree. I mean, a lot of us, therapists included, but those who are trying to work with perhaps their own anxiety, it's hard to tell the difference, I guess, in a way. And often people do default to a more sort of safety image, and we're trying to see, can we cultivate a sense of safeness? I guess you mentioned rock climbing, and that's an analogy I often use as well. And when we're doing the checks, we're making sure that the carabiner's properly attached, and we've got the harness on and so on. That's more the safety behaviours. But then once we're sure, and that feels good and comfortable, and we're up on the cliff, well, we're in a sense of safeness, and that then, even though we're doing something very expansive, and exploring, we're in safeness.
have you noticed another thing with that, which we haven't mentioned? I don't think I put it in the paper either, is your sense of yourself goes. You become in
Mm.
flow. You're in flow now. You're out enjoying you're in the climbing and smelling the air. You're in flow. So there's something about safeness which also facilitates a different experience of consciousness in the world. If you don't have that sharp sense of yourself, which you do when you're in the process of safety and all of that. So that ability to almost let go of your sense of self and be in the experience is also part of feeling safe.
Yeah, safety is protection, and safeness is expansion. I'm really going to sort of work with that one, I think, and because I think it's going to give us that that feeling of the world just sort of opens up for us, and when we have that sense of safeness.
That's right. That's right. I mean, when I'm with friends and so forth, the way that we chat about things and so forth, you're just free. You're not thinking about, Whereas if I'm with new people I've never met before, then you're a little bit more cautious, you
Mm, mm.
different.
So
Social trust is a very important thing.
yes, so social trust. So where does safeness dwell, and how do we shift into that? What does it feel like when we get there?
Well, I think this is crude and it's probably wrong, but I'll say it anyway. I think safety is all about the regulation of the sympathetic nervous system, and I think safeness is primarily vagal. But that's probably vastly too simplistic, but it's a useful beginning. To think about safety is about how you regulate the degree to which your threat system is being stimulated, whereas safeness is the degree to which you're able to explore and grow and have freedom and develop and have positive affect and stuff like that. But those are probably quite crude, simplistic distinctions, but they can be quite useful. So safeness is much more about the freedom to the secure base. Um, Whereas safety is about keeping, making sure that all the threats are sorted. So you need safety. I don't want people to think for a moment that
Mm.
that safety is important. It's very important if it's contextually appropriate. But it's then that other positive affect, that sense of engaging the world, and as you say, the flow when you're climbing and you're not really in yourself. You're in the action. You're in the moment. That all that is to do with feeling safe.
Yeah, the threat system is up-regulating, I guess, in some way. Sympathetic nervous system, perhaps. And the safety seeking is about trying to create a circumstance where we can feel less of that upregulation. Whereas safeness is more about a feeling of calmness, composure, safeness, but also things like curiosity, playfulness, exploring, and there's a social element to it. What are the specific types of social signals, or those interpersonal aspects that can sometimes really promote a sense of social safeness?
Yeah, so obviously, there's, it starts off, doesn't it, in the attachment system, when the baby first encounters the love and affection of a parent. Because love and affection are very important in close relationships. Oh, we were talking about love earlier, but in close relationships, particularly attachment relationships, love is very important. And we know that when mum and baby are attuned in their sense of connectedness, they actually are attuning their vagus nerves as well. Their vagus nerves are tuning in with each other. So that's very important. And the voice tones and the friendly face and the experience of affection coming from the other is a very powerful signal to the vagus nerve that you are safe. I'm not going to hurt you, and I'm going to be a resource for you. I'm here to play with you. I'm going to guide you, blah, 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 all that stuff. So the attachment aspect is crucial of the experience of the other as protecting you, but also facilitating you and as a source of a positive experience. And that is also important for play. And in fact, there was a brilliant conference here about 3 years ago on play, talking about the role of play in children and how play has to be interpersonal. And a lot of this play now on computer games is robbing children of these interpersonal interactions, of the smiling and playful interactions that they have. So play is extremely important, and that sense of positive affect that's associated with that social sense of connectedness, that is a type of positive affect which is fundamental to well-being, I think. And if you, as you know, that there's a difference between people who have been abused physically versus sexually, and there's also a difference between children who have been and people who have been neglected. Children who are being neglected and grow up, these are often people who are, when they get depressed, they're struggling. They don't really know what they want to do. I don't know. Do you have any prejudice? I don't know. Do you ever play? No, not really. They they're sort of, they haven't had that explorative, the capacity to explore and have preferences, and I want to do that, and that's great, and I can get fun of that's never been stimulated for them. Right? So they're just these sort of very quite flattened people that just feel inwardly sort of dead, really. They're
Mm.
not, they don't have that fear dynamic that the abused people tend to have, but they just have that sort of, and they can be quite tricky, and trying to support them into exploration, feeling safe, to have preferences, to make decisions, to be assertive. That can take a bit of time.
Mm. I did an interview with Graham Music
Yeah,
um, on his concept of resparking. And he presented last year, I think, at the CMF conference.
yeah.
But he was really making that distinction between those who've experienced a more fear-based trauma versus those perhaps who've experienced neglect, and the way that this really presents quite differently. But that's certainly the sort of $64 million question, isn't it? Like, well, is for the person who perhaps hasn't felt safe in that deeper sense of safe and secure
Yeah.
attachment, and the $64 million question is how to help them get there, like how to, kind of find or help them to find a
Well,
path to cultivating that sense of safeness.
I think it's a great question because a lot of what we do is talk with clients and explain to them, tell them about these different systems and how they might be working. What do they think about that? Does it seem like for you, you've never really been able to develop your explorative system? You haven't really had anybody that would encourage you with positive affect. You'd say to the client, you talk to me that maybe your mum was depressed, so she didn't really engage with you with fun and joy. And they can say, yeah, if they can begin to, yeah, that's sort of describes how it is for me. They say, okay, would that be something you'd be interested in doing? See if there are ways in which we can help you to begin to stimulate these areas that have never had a chance to. And so you kind of start to layer up. And I mean, you're very good at this because you do a lot of motivational interviewing. So it's that sort of helping them become motivated, to take an interest, to become curious And you do very simple things like helping them distinguish between music they like or the food they like, or do you prefer savory versus sweet? Well, I don't really know. Okay, well let's have a look at that then. Let's just start off very simply. Do you like to get into cold sheets at night or warm sheets at night? Or just finding simple areas where they can start to make preferences of like and dislike. That can be the beginning of them starting to this process of exploration. And of course, exploration requires that they are beginning to feel safe in how they explore. And it's okay not to like this and but to like that. All of that stuff. So it's a simple, whereas abuse people that it's not quite, it's different to that because they are much more into the issues of safety and so on. Whereas the neglect for people are not really, it's not that. It's the drive system is just not, just doesn't function. And the threat
Mm.
is less the threat system and much more just don't get turned on by it. You see what I mean?
Yes, for those who experience kind of the neglect, I guess, and have that more flat experience of life now, it's sort of little steps to build something that they can relate to about preferences and liking or disliking and making choices or feeling safe really to make choices. Actually, I do prefer getting into cold sheets or whatever it might be. But for the person though who has experienced more fear-based or perhaps shame-based traumatic experiences, then it might be more about habituation. There's a habituation aspect to it. It's still small steps, still trying to do the exposure, but the mechanism is more of a habituation mechanism or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. There is a complication to this, and you follow, which is in the feminist literature, there is a thing called silence. Jax, I think, wrote about it called silencing the self, which women can be more prone to. They get pushed more into submissive, compliant positions, where again, the issue of their own preferences and assertiveness can be difficult for them, and helping them to become more assertive and remember a case very, very early on. It was sad, really. The couple were quite close, but she was a people pleaser, very much a people pleaser. And so, whenever it came to sexual things, it was always about him, initiating and so forth. She never initiated. She never showed any preference. She just said, everything's fine, everything's fine. And in the therapy, he said, I think my wife loves me, but I really don't know because she never has any preferences. She'll do what I ask her to do, but does she love me? I just don't know. And that was such a tragic, and that really surprised her. And he said, because you never have any preferences, you just do what I want. I don't know whether you do it. And there was a very moving discussion between them. And it's all about this as a people pleaser, the suppression of the self, because I'm not allowed to have preferences. I'm not allowed to explore my own sexuality. I'm not allowed to explore my own preferences in art or music, whatever. I just have to go with what other people want. That, for those individuals, it's quite a movement to help them start to think about their own preferences, their own bodies, their own desires, their own wishes, their own. It can take a bit of time.
Because I assume that people pleasing is more in that safety seeking system.
Yeah, yeah,
And
that's
to
right.
feel
That's right.
safe,
That's right.
to have a preference or to make a suggestion or to lead a little bit, that feels scary.
See, I can feel safe with you, yeah, because I'm doing what you want. So I'm pleasing you, I'm pleasing you, I'm pleasing you. You're going to be okay, right? But I can't be free to do that. I'm not free to be me. I'm not free to discover me. I'm not free to discover or grow or flourish. I can only, I can only feel okay provided you're okay with me and I'm pleasing you.
So it's safety and not safeness.
Yeah, that's safety because you don't actually feel safe. But you'll feel safe provided your safety strategies are working.
Mm,
If your
mm.
safety strategies are working, then okay. But you won't be able to go against those safety strategies by having your own preferences.
You mentioned love, so let's go there. And I've got two thoughts actually. The first thought is you are also, like I am, I think, a big fan of the Beatles, and of course, the Beatles really sort of said all you need is love. So I guess there's that. The other thought I had was that I'm a big Carl Rogers fan, and I remember, as you're probably aware, you remember the Gloria tapes. That was those videos of sort of early examples, really, of psychotherapists or psychotherapy researchers demonstrating, I guess, their approach. And it was with that person, Gloria, and I remember Carl Rogers really mentioned in his preamble in that training video the notion of non-possessive love as part of his thinking with all of that, and it wasn't a romantic love or a sentimental love, but rather a humanistic love, a sort of acceptance, unconditional positive regard, a kind of prizing of the person, I think he said. But what are your thoughts really on where love fits in? Is sort of perhaps with the safeness, the social safeness, the relational safeness, attachment, and let alone compassion.
Well, I think it's a great question because as you know, I get a bit hot under the collar when people talk about compassion and love. They're totally different things. Love is very important in close relationships. I mean, mum and baby and friends and lovers and so on and so on. So love is very important. And we know a little bit about how it works in terms of dopamine, oxytocin, that sort of thing. The problem is oxytocin is the same hormone that makes you tribally violent. If anyone threatens you, you become more aggressive, right? So oxytocin is a tricky thing. So, and you're quite right that in some societies, some cultures, there are many different terms for the word love. There's different words for the love of God, love of your brother, love of parents, love of lovers, love of children. But in English, we've only got one word that's supposed to cover it all. And if you look up the word love in the dictionary, any word, any dictionary you like, Oxford, Collins, you'll all see that it's linked to liking, wanting, and being close to, right? I love pizzas, I love holidays, I love my wife. Right? Compassion is not that. It really is not that. Compassion is the sensitivity, it's the determination to address suffering. And in fact, there's a famous Buddhist scholar, is so famous I can't actually quite remember his name, but he argues that we should not be using the word love, but benevolence. It's the benevolent wish. Okay. And that idea of the wish for you to be free of suffering, and I would do what I can, regardless of whether I like you or not, or love you or not, is irrelevant. If you are suffering, I will do what I can to help you. Then, if you go to the Buddhist experience and some of Dan Siegel's stuff, who's written this book called Intra-Connectedness, the way they talk about love is totally different. This is a type of experience where we have this overwhelming sense of being part of everything and everything is part of us. And people, because we've done a documentary, I've been part of a documentary on this, and talking to people who've had these experiences, they will say it's absolutely overwhelming sense of bliss. There's a fantastic sense of safeness, as I would say. And love is the only word you can use, but it's not love. There is no other word you can use to describe this sense of complete belonging, complete being in all things. There is only one word, but it isn't that.
I see.
And
Yes.
there's some very interesting. I don't know if you know Robert Spira, who writes a lot about non-dual experience, and he says the problem with it is once you can describe it in language, you haven't experienced it, because the human brain is not capable of having these experiences and describing them. And there's a wonderful, he gives a wonderful, actually, this was a different person. There was a paper published some years ago, What's It Like to Be a Bat? And the argument is you will never know, because to become a bat, you will have to forget everything there is about being a human. You can't be a human being a bat. If you're a bat, that's what you are. Okay. And if you then become a human, remember being the bat, then that's not a bat. You are a human remembering about. But that isn't. So this idea that you have to lose the experience of self in order to experience something like becoming a bat or a dolphin or whatever, I think that is fascinating. So there's this whole issue around these non-dual experiences that actually, to use the human brain's systems and language systems to describe something that's indescribable outside of the biological dimension is a really problematic issue. So when it comes to love, right, intraconnectedness, as Dan Siegel calls it, that's a different thing at all. So love is great in close relationships, but some of the love that's talked about, like so you just got to be careful with some of these analogies, I think.
Mm. No, actually, I appreciate the term benevolence. Yeah, I can connect with that quite a lot. Um, and intra and interconnectedness and the non-duality and so on. Mm. Of course, Bruce Wayne once said, "Criminals are a superstitious lot. I will become a bat." But, and he became Batman. But anyway, that was just another silly joke. But yeah, one of the things Chris Irons and Charlie Herriot Maitland taught me, from their Compassionate Mind training program, really was the idea that in some ways we're going around the three circles model in an anti-clockwise direction. We might be in the threat system, and so we might move to the safe haven of the soothing-affiliative system. And then from the secure base of the soothing system, we might then go out to drive and explore the world and so on. Does that feel about right for you? Again, a simplistic way of getting the message across, but yeah, does that feel right?
No, absolutely. And we wrote about that in 89 in Human Nature and Suffering. That's exactly, again, it's pure attachment theory. It's not, it's not in CFT. I mean, CFT's taking it on, but that's exactly what attachment theory says, that when the child becomes distressed, firstly, you need the safe haven, you need that ability to do that. And then when the child has done that and they're starting to just let go of the sense of threat, they're not being overstimulated by a threat. Now the attention system opens up to the possibility of exploration. So yes, it's absolutely the case. It's not particularly CFT. It's again, it's attachment theory, but yeah, you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, I just love the way that you've managed to create this very sort of face valid and very helpful model that people can really understand. You actually have a very recent paper titled "Caring and the Evolution of Guilt:
Yeah.
A Biopsychosocial Approach to a Pro-Social Emotion" from the Oxford Handbook of Evolution and Emotions.
My goodness, you're reading loads of stuff here. God, that's a
You're my hero,
amazing.
Paul, and I read everything I can get my hands on. But I think it speaks to another important point that you really try to make about guilt and that it's different to shame, and that it's really coming from a different motivational system, I think. And I think the distinction between safety seeking and safeness really matters and is perhaps part of that too. So I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about guilt and where that might fit in with respect to safeness, affiliation, social safeness, and so on.
Yeah, it's great. So, I mean, as we've been talking, these are slippery things and they all blend into each other a little bit. So we always talk about the guides rather than, things that can guide your ways of thinking as opposed to clarity of, clear boundaries. So guilt and shame is like that. So, and again, this isn't an original idea from me. I was reading a book by John Crook, who was one of my heroes, and he wrote a book called The Evolution of Consciousness. He was an ethologist and a Zen Buddhist. He was professor at Bristol, actually, in ethology. And he wrote about the attachment system created a awareness of potentially harming the infant and how the parent needed to be very sensitive to not causing harm, either by physical harm or by not providing for the infant. So, chicks in the nest, and the mother and father have to again, put worms down them and that sort of thing. Um, and that if there was an awareness that harm had been caused either through, some actual harm or for the lack of providing, the parent needed to be alerted to that. Because if the parent were not alert to the harm that they themselves were either causing or through action or non-action, then obviously their infants would suffer. So he argued that guilt was the process by which attachment kept the attention to the behavior of the parent so that the parent didn't do things that were harmful to the infant, right? So that was back in 1980, whenever it was. And I was reading this stuff about the evolution of guilt as linked to the attachment system to maintain attention, not to do things that are harmful to the infant. And that seemed to me absolutely right. And then I went on and did some other stuff and looked at that in a bit more detail. And so guilt really is that. And when we look at guilt, we see that guilt has very different emotions to shame. So guilt is usually a sense of sadness. There's usually a sense of regret, a sense of remorse, and a sense of wanting to repair or do something to repair the harm that's been done to the other through omission or commission. And guilt is very important as part of the caring system because, we will do things that are hurtful, we will do things that are harmful, and our ability to recognize that and have a desire to put it right, I think that's very, very important. And when people realize that, okay, so maybe you've said something unpleasant to me, but now you reflected on it and you realize that was hurtful and you are genuinely sorry, then forgiveness follows from guilt, right? Forgiveness doesn't really follow from shame, okay? Shame is really about the doing stuff that renders you inferior, rejectable, undesirable, right? It's the rank system. Shame is all about the rank system. And as you know, we often use the example of the people having the affairs, Fred and Harry, and Harry having an affair and his partner discovers it and he has a sense of guilt, remorse because he's understood he's hurt his partner and he wants to repair that remorse and he's honest and as best he can with his partner. Harry, on the other hand, has a sense of shame. He feels that his wife or partner is no longer going to care for them anymore. That their reputation has been ruined. So they now want to kind of repair the relationship because they want to be loved again. They want to repair the reputation. Shame is about repairing your reputation, your sense of being right, your desirability in the eyes of the other person, that you still want me. I'm not so bad. You know what I mean? You're not going to see me and reject me, are you? That's shame. Guilt's not about that. Guilt is saying, well, if that makes you feel better to reject me, then I'll have to accept that, I'm not a bad person because of, whereas in shame, it's all about that. So shame is very much to do with the rank system, being demoted, put down, the loss of reputation as a social agent, whereas guilt is the care system. It's about having harmed against your wishes. The problem with guilt comes, however, when people actually are cruel and they want to cause harm. Harm is the point of what they want to do. They want to cause suffering, they vengeance. So vengeance and guilt tend to be are absolutely opposites. If you get motivated for vengeance, then your guilt system is absolutely turned off. And that's a problem. We see it in the world all the time in all the wars that are going on now. Once you're into vengeance, guilt goes out the window. And so you've really got problems. So when we start losing our capacity to feel remorse for causing harm, then we enjoy causing harm, then we're in trouble. Human brains in serious trouble.
Yes, yeah, I know you've spoken before about vengeance, even in kind of popular
Yeah.
culture and movies and things like that. It just taps into the sort of the dark side of what it is to be a human being, really, doesn't it? And how do we bring compassion and change
Yeah.
to all of that? It's tricky.
It's very, very tricky. It is, and a lot of it, as you know, because we've talked about this, it's stimulated by competitive cultures. The more competitive the culture, the more you get this kind of stuff, right, going on. And a lot of male on male violence, which is very bad for males, actually, where you see all the bad guys and then the good guys come in and torture them and blow them away. And everybody goes home, yeah, they got what was coming to them. Yeah. But actually that psychology is bad. That's a poison in us, because that's how we see the world. There are good guys and there are bad guys, and we're the good guys, and we're going to hurt the bad guys, and that's what we're going to be doing, right? And what it is to be a good guy is to be able to stand up against the bad guys. Well, that's such a adolescent, simplistic way of seeing the world. It's not at all
Mm.
helpful. Um, we have to understand, actually, it's a lot more complicated than that.
One of your chapters that I found very important was the 2007 chapter about the evolutionary biopsychosocial model of shame, and just the way that you talked about the external shame, the internal shame, the humiliation,
Yeah.
the reflected shame, of course, and the way that you started to sort of parcel out all of these different aspects, I guess, to shame, and the way that, well, it motivates different responses, and the role of social rank and reputational elements and all of that. Quite different, really, from guilt, which might be much more motivating us towards making amends and repairing relationships. But you've said a couple of times today that these aren't your ideas, I suppose, and aren't necessarily directly from CFT, but I suppose the thing you do so incredibly well is sort of integrating the science into this model of the mind. And I mean, the shame model is yours, but you like to bring in a whole lot of other stuff, to add to your model of CFT. And the third recent publication, just briefly, is an evolution and compassion-informed biopsychosocial approach to the challenge of building an integrated science for psychotherapy, which is a chapter in the book Integrating Psychotherapy and Psychophysiology, Theory, Assessment and Practice. And that's this idea of not worrying too much, I think, about pitting therapies against each other or that sort of thing, but rather trying to have a process-based approach, and bring the science together, really. What are some of the implications of that for CFT or for therapists, I suppose, generally, and the various evolved functions, I suppose, the safety, the safeness, and how that might all, kind of go across therapies? Any thoughts there?
Well, it's a wonderful question, Stan, because as you know, I was an economist originally, and so when I did my economics degree, you do a sort of a simple model of the economy and how labor markets work and how financial markets. Then a little bit more complicated. Then you had international markets, and so you were building these models because you needed to be able to predict and forecast economic changes and to develop economic policies, right? When I came into psychology, I suddenly there was a course on motivation, there was social psychology, there was a course on linguistics, there was behavioral. It was all split up. There was no real sense of how this all worked as a system. So that was one of the things that when I came, because I was destined to be a psychologist, so I had to retrain, do another degree. So I was really interested in so how does motivations work with emotions then? How do they go together then? And how does cognition work with motivation? So I was always very interested in that because I had that sort of, jigsaw like, let's put the jigsaw together mindset. And then, so I was always interested in that. And my first book in 84, From Psychology to Brain State, was all about the interactions between different processes, attachment and rank, and how they created these brain states for depression. And then when I came into psychotherapy, I was lucky enough to do my PhD in Edinburgh with Ivy Blackburn. And so Tim Beck used to come over and do training with us, and I learned my CBT from that. But I was still interested in motivation. Well, where's the motivation system? And what became very odd to me, actually. It was the fact that, and I wrote about this in Human Nature and Suffering in '89, psychologists suddenly forgot they were psychologists, right?
Mm.
And they just dumped half of the, they'd be just focusing on cognitive. Now, if you talk to Tim Beck said, look, he was developing a model of therapy that was easy to understand and easy for people to. He was very keen that people would learn how to help themselves by monitoring their thoughts and being able to stand back, looking at how they acquire these dysfunctional beliefs or whatever it was. He wasn't interested, and he said, I was never interested in developing complex models of the mind. I wanted to find a therapy that would help people that had, basic heuristics.
Mm.
And it
Mm.
was great. And we had conversations, and he wrote a lovely endorsement of my depression book, if you remember, and stuff like that. Loads of conversations during the 80s. But I was interested in developing a model of the mind. I certainly was interested in that. And so that we could then begin to understand how these different processes interacted and worked, So that was always my kind of key thing, right? So I just did what I was trained to do as an economist, which was how does X work with Y? How does Y work with Z? How do they work together? How do they interact? What happens when they interact? And also the concept of emergence was very important. And when you put processes together, new things arise. Um, in economic theory, that's really quite important. If you have a, failure of a harvest somewhere, like what's happening now in Ukraine with the wheat and all the rest of it, that has massive knock-on effects to other parts of the world. And parts of the world are struggling. You've got starvation, So these interactional processes, these knock-on effects. So if your motivational system is orientated to be very competitive and you have to achieve that's going to have a knock-on effect to other processes. That's going to affect how you pay attention. That's going to affect to your values. It's going to affect your behaviors. That's going to affect the relationships you form, because you're going to be forming relationships with people that you think are going to advance your career, not those that are going to hold you back. So all these processes are highly interactive processes, and helping therapists think about them. And then you get into the thing that you and I have talked about, which is that you then discover that many therapies have got some fantastic wisdoms. Motivational interviews got some brilliant ways of helping people uh, develop motivation for change. Emotion focused therapy has got some really fantastic ways of helping people become sensitive. Their emotion mindfulness has got some wonderful ways of helping people. Cognitive therapy, ACT, DBT, they've all got some fantastic things, but they shouldn't be just parceled up in just in these silos of these. They are basically should be integrated into a science of psychological change, because they're all very useful, but for different people at different times.
Yeah, no, I do notice myself channeling you often, I think, and reminding myself and others as well, about motivation. That's often the people sort of forget, I notice, and they remember feelings and thoughts and behaviors, but what's the motivation behind
That's
all
right.
of that? I think, is what I absolutely learned from you. Well, before finishing up, if people are interested in you and your work and your team there at the Compassionate Mind Foundation, and perhaps, kind of wanting to engage with you and what you're doing, where can people find you and connect?
Yeah, so the first protocol is our website, www.compassionatemind.co.uk. And we've just put a whole new series of personal practices with breathing and so on there. Um, and then there's an email called hello@compassionate.co.uk, compassionatemind.co. So that goes into our team, and people can get me from there. And there's also my academic email, which are which is on all my papers, which is p.gilbert@derby.ac.uk. So that's
Mm,
you can get me through
mm.
that. If you just want to contact me, not too many, so I get flooded with emails. I get a bit lost.
No, I think people can go through the Compassionate Mind Foundation. Um, which has a conference, I think, coming up in October. Yeah, just remind us of the theme of the conference this year.
Yeah, well, it was lovely to see you there last year, Dan, and because I know you came with your daughter, which was great, but then you unfortunately got that horrible flu, didn't you? That
I
knocked you
did. Yeah.
awful for you. We were so sad. Come all that way. Okay, so this year is on compassion for the harmful side. And so we have 3 days. One day is on compassion and harm done to others. So we have our forensic colleagues talking to us about the work they do in the prisons and with forensic populations. We've got Dan Gretton, who wrote an amazing book on what are basically what he calls desktop killers, the ways in which so many of us don't stand up against injustice, that or the fossil industry and stuff like that, and
Ah, yes.
the stuff on the Nazis and all kinds of things. So that's great, and we've got Jasvinder Sangara, who's done a lot of work on honor killing and shame in certain communities. And then the next day we've got harm to self, and we've got work on shame and self-harm and suicidality. We've got Rory O'Connor coming to give us a workshop and a keynote on suicidality. And then the last day we've got a reconciliation. So we've got work on things like forgiveness and people presenting on forgiveness. We've got Everett Worthington offering something, and Jennifer Dell talking about compassion in politics, about how do you actually bring compassion to the dark side? How do you create capacities for reconciliation? How do you create peaceful societies? Because one of the interesting things, and you might have read it in the paper, is that the threat-based or safety-based using deterrence to stop countries going to war with each other is always very fragile. And there's a wonderful book called The Puzzle of Peace. If anybody wants to read it, it's a brilliant book, The Puzzle of Peace. And it looks at what happened in 1945 and 1948, where the United Nations set up this amazing charter of how to try to create world peace. And anyway, one of the key things that they point out in The Puzzle of Peace is that when you have countries that are keeping safe by weaponizing themselves. So if you harm me, I can harm you better. That nearly always ends in tears eventually. Whereas if you create peace, then you create safeness. And when you create safeness, you create interconnected countries. So Europe is very unlikely to go to war again, because not because we're threatening, France is threatening Germany or Italy is threatening Germany. It's because they're highly interconnected societies now,
Mm.
and therefore they have an interest in being with each other and traveling, blah 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 blah, taking an interest in the other countries and so forth. The ability to travel, for people to travel and get to know other countries and get familiar with cultures and restaurants or whatever it is. All of that process of facilitating this freedom, you're free to go here, go there, get to know these places, get to see that these people that you thought you might want to bump, these are people just like you. And just like you, they have families, and just like you, they want their children to grow up and play football or whatever it is. And just like you, they take pleasure in their national cuisine or whatever it is. That capacity to create that awareness of the other is just like you, that empathic ability, they are just like me. And also, when it comes to things like war, the ability to have that empathic position, if that were me, if that were my children being bombed, if that were my wife being raped or whatever it is, if that were me, and that motivates this desire that we have to stop this stuff. The dark side, that's what this conference is about, the harmful side. It's done terrible things and continues to do terrible things because we haven't worked out how to stop it. We haven't worked out how do we create a compassionate world where people simply don't do this stuff. They don't want to do this stuff. They don't want to march into other countries. They don't want to do all this stuff, and be harmful to each other. So that's my great passion.
Well, what a place to land. Because imagine if we could move the world from threat based safety seeking to a sense of safeness, that is between
That is
and amongst all of us.
That's absolutely, you got it, Stan. That's absolutely it. How do we shift people to a greater sense of being safe,
Yes.
and not so threat focused, and not thinking that, if I can threaten you, then that somehow keeps me safe. I mean, it sort of does a little bit, but it's always very fragile.
Well, Professor Paul Gilbert, I could keep speaking with you and learning from you for hours, but I better let you go. You're a wealth of knowledge and experience and wisdom, obviously in the area of compassion and how to be helpful,
Yeah.
basically, and is the thing. And so, thank you for everything you do, and thank you for speaking with me on compassion in a t-shirt.
Well, thank you, Stan. And they're wonderful compassion t-shirt programs. As I say, I listen to them when oh, the next one's coming out, and the one that Nico did was amazing. I helped write the baby, but I still learned a lot from that. So
Yeah.
always great to listen to your compassion and t-shirts. Long may they continue. And thank you so much for having me on your show.
Thank you very much.